Today we are going to be taking notes on Mendel's theory, which explains why we have some of our parents' traits, but not all. Make sure you have copied down heredity, traits, fertilization, and asexual and sexual reproduction from the board. We're not going to go over them at this time. We're going to begin with the allele. An allele is the version of a gene. So on every chromosome there are many genes. And genes are going to code for different things: hair color, eye color, etc. An allele is the specific version of that gene. So in this case, in a plant, they may have a gene for flower color. And so the gene itself is flower color, but the allele is going to be what color it is actually coding for. So this particular flower has, we'll say it got this chromosome from its mother and it got this chromosome from its father. So it inherited a purple flower allele and a white flower allele, coding for the specific gene of flower color. So, will this flower be purple or white will depend on which one dominates and expresses itself. And so all of our different genes are going to have a dominant allele, a recessive allele, or just dominant alleles, just recessive alleles, etc. And we'll take a look at that here in a moment. Dominant and recessive alleles are what I was explaining before with the purple and the white. So an allele is going to be expressed if it is dominant, as long as that dominant allele is there. If that dominant allele is not there, then that allows the recessive alleles to be expressed. So here, for example, we see that the dominant trait of freckles is represented with a capital F. So we represent dominant alleles with capital letters. We represent recessive alleles with lowercase letters. So if a person has freckles, we know they have a dominant allele, or that capital F, on one of their two alleles that code for that gene because they have freckles. We see physically that they have freckles. If that person does not have freckles, then we know that they don't have any capital F at all, because if they did, then that trait would be expressed. And so a dominant trait is going to always dominate. Recessive will only show if the dominant allele is not there. So for examples, I do not have freckles, so I do not have a capital F, a dominant freckle allele. I have two lowercase alleles showing that I'm not going to have freckles. Another example here is with eye color. Eye color is very complex. As far as genetics go, there isn't actually just one gene that tells us our eye color. There's many that play into it, but for simplistic purposes, we'll say it's only one gene, and we'll just look at the difference between brown and blue eyes. So here we have a brown-eyed parent and a brown-eyed parent here. And in this instance, we know that the parent has one capital B allele and one lowercase b allele that code for the gene of eye color. Right, so same thing with this parent here. And so we know that the trait is dominant because of this capital letter. Right, so the trait for eye color that dominates in this case is brown eyes. And so if the person has a capital B present at all, you can see they're going to have brown eyes because that's the dominant trait. Even if that little b is there, if the capital B is there as well, it's the one that dominates. And so the only way that we can potentially have a blue-eyed offspring is when two little b's are there. We have to have both of those small b's present. So what I would like you to do now is to pause and head over to a class kick and try to see if you can figure out which trait is dominant and which trait is recessive on the first slide. The next thing we're going to look at is genotype and phenotype. And these are going to be the difference between what we see on the actual gene in the chromosome and what we physically see. So the genotype is the combination of specific alleles, right? So down here we have an example where we're looking at pea plant color. So if the pea is yellow, it will have either a capital A and a capital A, or a capital A and a lowercase a, because the capital A is the dominant trait, which happens to be yellow. We have to have that capital A to be yellow. And so this over here is the genotype. This is what we actually have on the gene. The genotype is the gene that is there. Whatever gene is there is going to determine the phenotype. So how that physically appears. So we can see here our genotype determines our phenotype. That's super important because that's going to be telling us what we physically see, how we see that trait expressed in that person or organism. So the phenotype here, as we can see, is that physical characteristic. And that's one of the best ways that you can remember the difference between phenotype and genotype. Genotype sounds like gene, and so it's telling us what those genes are. Phenotype and physical both start with PH. So we can remember that if we're looking at what is the person or what is that organism's phenotype, we are talking about what do they physically look like because of that gene that they have. So in this case, if the person's genotype is 2 capital A's, that's dominant for yellow, and so their genotype is the 2 capital A's, this is their genotype. Physically, we see that as a yellow pea. And so the phenotype is that it's a yellow pea. At this time, please pause and head back over to Class Kick and do the genotype-phenotype slide. The last major concepts that we're going to look at today are what we call homozygous and heterozygous, and that's for their alleles. So a homozygous is going to be when 2 alleles are the same, exactly the same. And so we can have homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. And if you remember, the prefix homo means same. So an organism that has homozygous traits for a specific, or homozygous alleles for a specific trait, will have the exact same letter for those traits, for those alleles. And so we can see here that this organism in the middle here, individual B, has 2 brown traits. And we know that brown eyes are dominant. And so this organism, whoever it is, would have homozygous alleles for brown eyes. And because we know that it's dominant, they would be represented by 2 capital B's. And so they are homozygous, and we also can say they are dominant. So this individual B is homozygous dominant for brown eyes. Now, individual C, you can see they have 2 blue eyes. Well, we know that blue eyes is recessive, and so they're going to be represented with 2 little b's for the blue eyes that they have. So this person has a blue-eyed allele on one of their chromosomes, and on the other chromosome they also have the blue-eyed allele. Because they are the same as each other, they are homozygous. Because they are both lowercase, they are recessive. So here, individual B was homozygous dominant because both were capitalized. Here for individual C, they are homozygous because they're both lowercase, but because they're lowercase, it's recessive. Now, heterozygous, on the other hand, is when a person has one of each. So they have both an uppercase and a lowercase allele. And so hetero, we know, means different. So they are different from each other. And so here we see that there's a lowercase b to give them the blue allele, and then there would be a capital B to give them the brown allele. And because that capital B is there, this person, individual A, will have brown eyes because that dominant trait dominates. And so we know that. That's the default. We do not have to state that this is heterozygous dominant, because when it's heterozygous, we know we have a dominant and a recessive, and that dominant trait is going to dominate. So individual A has brown eyes, individual B has brown eyes, and individual C has blue eyes. Go ahead and hop back over to Class Kick and try slide number 3, and then come back for the very last slide here, and then you'll have one more thing to do in Class Kick. So putting this all together, we can see in a Punnett square what the odds of a child being born with specific traits are. And so in this case, we're looking at the child's ability to roll their tongue. And so rolling their tongue is where you kind of put your tongue in like a straw-like shape, where you kind of fold the sides up together. And so rolling of the tongue is a dominant trait. And so the father here, you can see, is not able to roll his tongue. He has 2 lowercase r's, so he is homozygous recessive for tongue rolling. The mother can roll her tongue. And so that's all we know. We don't know if the mom is homozygous dominant for tongue rolling or if she is heterozygous. And so what we have to look at is just those odds. So if mom can roll her tongue, we know she has to have a capital R. That is a given. What the other R is going to depend on her genetics, which we can't necessarily see. So if she were homozygous dominant for tongue rolling, she would have 2 capital R's, and every possible offspring would be heterozygous for tongue rolling. They would be able to roll their tongue, and they'd have a capital and a lowercase because of their parents. If mom had the lowercase r, she was heterozygous for tongue rolling, then 2 of the offspring would be heterozygous and 2 of the offspring would be homozygous recessive. So they would not be able to roll their tongue. So you can see here that if mom is heterozygous, there's a 50% chance that the offspring can roll their tongue. And if she is homozygous recessive, or homozygous dominant, excuse me, there's a 100% chance that the offspring will be able to roll their tongue. So now what I would like you to do is pause and head back over to Class Kick to give a Punnett square a try. And then from here out, we will do a lot more work with Punnett squares throughout the next couple of days.